There you go. All right, thanks everybody so much for joining us tonight. I'm Andrew Gustafson. I am the curator of interpretation at the Johnson County Museum here in Overland Park, Kansas. As curator of interpretation, that means I get to help people access history, and I get to do that through research and writing for our temporary exhibitions, through adult programming like this, social media and blogs, and special tours that we do. So it's always fun to have different programming every month, and this one should be a really interesting one. I do want to give you just a little heads up. This is Zoom webinar. It looks a little different than Zoom meetings you might be used to. You'll be able to interact with our participants tonight through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. If you're able to see chat feature, I don't believe that's enabled for participants and attendees tonight. So we'll be using the Q&A feature. As we go along tonight, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Erik Scott from KU, and he'll be talking about a digital history program called Cold War in the Heartland. So let's go ahead and get started.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us on this lovely Thursday evening. So happy to do this program and really excited, as I'll talk about in a bit. I really am excited to hear your Cold War memories because so much of this project has been about uncovering the hidden history in our backyard here in Northeast Kansas. So my name is Erik Scott. I am the director of KU's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. I'm also a Russian historian. I'm a historian of Russia. And so this was actually a very unique project for me for several reasons. It was one that was much more of a collaborative effort. Historians often go off in the archives alone and spend hours writing up what we find sitting solitary by a computer. This was really a collaborative effort. The project was supported by a grant from the U.S.-Russia Foundation, which is interested in developing expertise on Russia in the region. And I worked with a team of graduate students to put it together. I want to mention the work done by Andrew Avery, Preston Decker, the work done by Alana Holland, Devin McFadden, and Steve Mutz. I also want to acknowledge the graduate students who were able to join me today, Adam Roger, Mike Hill, and Marjorie Galeli. And also want to mention while I'm on it, our wonderful web designer, Alyssa Gonzalez. So this was a collaborative effort and somewhat of a heroic one because it really got started last spring and early summer when the pandemic was hitting and things were pretty much closed. And so at the height of COVID restrictions, volunteers from the Watkins Museum of History here in Lawrence, the Dole Institute of Politics, as well as private citizens in Lawrence like Bob Swan, took pictures of documents with their phones and cameras, sent them to us and gathered them to us. And so what we wanted to do is in this website, really create a documentation of the diversity of Cold War experiences and memories in the Midwest, and complicate the way people typically think about the Cold War as something that happened far away from where we are, and really show the global connections of the Midwest region, of the Heartland. So this project was also a departure for me because it was very local. I normally get on a plane and travel to Russia or Ukraine or Georgia to do my research, but I really this project was really about finding what's available in our backyard. And a lot of the Cold War history in the Midwest is really hidden in plain sight. And I think part of that is there's a mythology of the American heartland, that it's this unchanging essence of the country, that it's isolated, that it's quote unquote the middle of nowhere, but also that it's somehow pure and quintessentially American and unchanged by new ideas. And this is maybe a crude summary, but I think this is a really mythology that holds inside the region, and it's also the way that many people outside the Midwest see this part of the country. But if we look at the evidence, this is a place that was profoundly transformed by the Cold War. It was the birthplace of 4 of the 9 US presidents who served during the Cold War. It was a site of Winston Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech. It was one of the places where Nikita Khrushchev, the first Soviet leader to visit the U.S., came. When he came in 1959, he visited farmland in Iowa, and it was a big part of his trip. It was a place whose local grain trade was bound up on selling grain to the USSR. Its landscape was transformed by the construction of new military bases, missile silos, as well as the transformation of existing ones. And it was the site of all kinds of interesting citizen diplomacy projects, including citizen-led efforts that brought the Soviet basketball team, the Soviet track and field team to KU in the early 1980s. And so what we want to do as website is document this, take this history, make it accessible to high school students, to middle school students, to college students, to those who may have been born after the Cold War and only sort of think of the Cold War as consisting of the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Berlin Wall or the war in Vietnam, and really ground that history in a local context. And so we have several different parts of the website that I'll quickly show to you. And I want to briefly go through them, and then we'll go on to our graduate students who have done a lot of the hands-on research for this project, and they'll say a bit more about the different aspects of the website that they've worked on. But let me quickly go through and show you what we have. And this website, as I should mention, coldwarheartland.ku.edu, is available for anyone to use. So if you're interested in the Cold War and want to learn about it, if you're a teacher who teaches on the Cold War and wants something to show your students, if you're a student, that's probably a little late, but still looking for that final project, there's all kinds of very interesting materials here. So let me share my screen and quickly go through what is there, and I encourage you to explore it on your own. So this, as I mentioned, is a web resource that really is sort of interested in a polyphonic, a sort of multivalent exploration of what this complex history of the Cold War entails. And I'll quickly scroll down and just go through the main sections. So we have a section of documents that pulls together documents that you won't find on any sort of major Cold War textbook or in other online Cold War collections. These are all very local history documents that portray a very interesting regional side of a global conflict. So we have documents on the US-Soviet grain trade, which was strongly opposed by many Kansas farmers who held very strong anti-Soviet, anti-communist ideas, but over time became enmeshed in this grain trade. We have documents on Nikita Khrushchev's visit to Iowa. We have documents on the filming of the famous television movie The Day After here in Lawrence. And we have documents pertaining to athletic exchanges and citizen exchanges that happened between the US and the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Going back to the main page, the next section consists of landscapes. And so what we mean by landscapes are both the physical landscape and the cultural landscape of the Cold War. And this is a really, really neat part of the website that Marjorie will talk some more about. But we have case studies of the Topeka Regional Airport, which was a crucial hub in America's military strategy during the Cold War, of an atomic lab in Ohio, excuse me, that was hidden away, and a really interesting investigation of missile sites in Douglas County. The next section of the website consists of oral history. So these are interviews that we did with people who experienced the Cold War, and there's a really diverse group of people. There are, it's the whole range of different perspectives, and I think you'll find here different views, even possessed by people who lived during the same time period. And so I'm curious during the Q&A section, to hear the audience's views of the Cold War, because I think one thing we found is people's memories are really quite different about what this period consisted of and what it actually means now in retrospect. we have a section also on Cold War legacies, and here we try to bring together the way the conflict is remembered here in the U.S. and the way it's remembered in Russia. And I would argue, and I'm also a historian who works on the global Cold War, and I'm finishing a book right now on Soviet defectors during the Cold War and the impact that had on the international refugee regime. The legacies of the Cold War very much continue to shape Russian-U.S. relations, even 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Finally, we have some things specifically for teachers, maybe not only for teachers, but some teaching resources available if teachers want to work with their students to help them do their own oral histories, case studies, primary source analyses. And finally, we have a timeline. This timeline is really neat because it takes, the famous international events of the Cold War, and it places within them local events. So you can see here that some of these very important global events, and then local events placed in that time frame. I always tell my students that historians don't, despite what you think, we don't spend a lot of time memorizing dates and facts, but it is really helpful to understand how local events are connected and contextualized by global events. So that's a very, very brief overview, and I do want to make sure we have time for the other graduate students to share their stories and their experiences. And I also want to make sure we have time for a general discussion, because I'm really curious to hear from the audience about any questions you have, but also any memories you might have of some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. So without further ado, who would like to go next? Perhaps we should go in order of the website. So maybe I'll have Mike go first, then Adam, and then Marjorie. Does that sound okay? Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Scott for imagining and organizing this project and for thinking of me and extending an offer to me to participate. And I'd like to thank Johnson County Museums for hosting this event tonight. So I worked on two pieces for the website. The first is Friends or Foes, the US-Soviet grain trade in the Cold War. And the second is Sports and Citizen Diplomacy in the Heartland. I'll just talk very briefly about each of those. Heading into the piece on the grain trade, I knew that the US sold grain and other products to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but I didn't really have a grasp on the significance of the US-Soviet grain trade in its totality. But like I point out in the piece, in 1972, 1/4 of the entire US wheat harvest was sold to the Soviet Union. That really kind of surprised me. I also found it interesting that discussions of ending the grain trade with the Soviet Union, in retrospect, perhaps kind of subvert our typical views of political party ideology. For example, it was the Democratic President Jimmy Carter, often accused of being soft on communism, who was in favor of canceling grain contracts in order to punish the Soviet Union for invading Afghanistan, while Republican Senator in Kansas Bob Dole and President Ronald Reagan, both of whom I think are firmly entrenched in our memories as Cold War warriors, fought hard to keep grain contracts with the Soviet Union open. In a more local example, I found a letter written by a Kansas businessman to his congressional representative, both insightful and for me a little humorous. When considering whether or not the US should sell wheat to the Soviet Union, he wrote, this is a quote, "If a gangster came into my place of business during business hours and wanted to buy something and had the cash to pay, then I would sell to him. But I would also keep an eye on him to see he didn't pick up something on the side." I think that's a really interesting line. I really like the metaphor he uses, not necessarily for purposes of accuracy, but for purposes of getting into the mind of this guy. And I think it sheds light on how political ideology and financial concerns wrestled within the hearts of many Americans and the minds of many Americans during this time. I also really enjoyed working on the sports piece about Soviet athletes' participation in the 1983 Kansas relays. Personally, as a sports enthusiast, I sometimes feel the need to defend the far too many hours I spend watching and reading about sports. So seeing an example of sports being used to help overcome significant political and ideological divisions has helped me to justify, in my own mind anyway, my obsession with sports. More importantly, though, speaking with Robert Swan was an amazing opportunity. He shared so much more than I could ever hope to actually fit into the piece that made it up onto the website. But I hope I did justice to our conversation and his years of efforts aimed at easing the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. In researching this piece, I really appreciated how the humanity of both the Americans and the Soviets shined through. I also appreciated the cultural confusion that showed up from time to time. For example, the Soviet newspaper Sovietsky Sport reported that among the many letters written by Lawrence residents in favor of allowing the Soviet athletes to compete in the Kansas relays, there was one by a young American student named Alan Fieldhouse, who encouraged the Soviet delegation to visit us and win many medals. Apparently, and in fairness, understandably, the Soviets were unaware that Allen Fieldhouse is actually the home arena for the University of Kansas basketball teams. For me, a big takeaway from these pieces and the rest of the website is something that historians, I think, know well, that the world and life are really complicated and messy and defy easy categorization. As much as we may want to boil things down to the most simplistic diametrical opposites in 280 characters or less, doing so is rarely accurate or useful. So, for example, knowing that Kansas farmers distrusted and at times despised the Soviet Union, but at the same time depended on selling their grain to Soviets, thus creating a kind of alliance with them, raises questions, for me anyway, about conservatives and liberals, capitalism and socialism. And I think the story about the Kansas relays can serve as an example of how everyday citizens can take action in useful and meaningful ways to help produce long-term change without antagonizing others along the way. And I think the stories told in both pieces speak to the humanity that exists within us all. Maybe this is a bit too on the head during these times, but I know from where I sit, it often looks like people identify others as enemies and refuse to look for commonalities. Few conflicts in modern history, I think, were as ideologically charged as the Cold War. And if Americans and Soviets during those years could, at least at times, find ways to bridge their ideological chasms, perhaps we might learn from their example and do the same. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mike. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Scott and the center for setting this up, and the museum as well. This has been a really rewarding project to work on. I think the thing about it that's the most exciting to me is the way that it hopefully will teach students, and not just students, but the way it teaches all of us about how close the Cold War was and still is to all of us. It's still a lot closer than most of us realize in a lot of different ways, chronologically and geographically. It's close to us in some ways because we have family members who lived through a lot of it, and some of the more harrowing events of the Cold War. I know a lot of us lived through it too ourselves, but for the students who will use this resource, that's probably not true. But for them, their parents did, their aunts and uncles and grandparents and older siblings perhaps, and their teachers and many others in their lives experienced it firsthand. One of the topics that I researched for this project was about a group of people called the Downwinders, who are people who lived in the region where the US military tested its nuclear weapons, or in that general area. And this was a really personal project for me because my mother's family is actually from that region in the Southwest, in southern Utah. And one of the interviews that we conducted for the site was me conducting an interview with my aunt, who is actually old enough to remember seeing the pink clouds of nuclear blasts floating over their house, to remember the way that the dust would settle on their gardens and clotheslines. She talked at length about her experiences there and those of her mother, who was my grandmother, what they were told about the testing that happened, what they believed about it, how it affected their day-to-day life, how it changed the way they related to their country and their community. And I left my own words out of the interview as it's published because the point is her perspective. But if you could hear me on the recordings, you'd see how shocked I was at the way that the nuclear tests and fallout were downplayed, how people were told just to stay inside for a few hours, dust off their clothes, and wash their vegetables, and everything would be fine. And as I said, this will hopefully get the students and others who read it to become curious about the way that the Cold War affected the lives of their own families. The impact of these tests stretched on even to today, as thousands of people have developed different sorts of diseases as a result from these tests. It's certainly affected my family as well. My grandmother had a miscarriage as a result of that exposure, and several members of my family, including my mother, have developed cancers connected to those tests. And the point of this project, of course, the point of it isn't to air grievances about this or that family, or to make a personal point, but the point is to show the reader, to show these probably students and hopefully more, that this sort of thing had a profound impact on people in all areas of the country, not just people in government or people in industries that we generally associate with it, but people all over the country were profoundly impacted by these things. And hopefully students will then go on to ask their parents about how the Cold War impacted them and the rest of their families, so they can get a sense of how close it is to all of us in terms of, in experience. Now, the projects that I researched also showed how the Cold War was incredibly close to us geographically as well. One of the articles that I worked on, which Dr. Scott mentioned, was a research regarding the Albacraft facility, which is a research and uranium enrichment facility near Oxford, Ohio, which is just about an hour north of Cincinnati. This was sort of a similar situation where nuclear material was being regularly and quietly handled for decades in a small town where very few of the residents ever even knew it was happening. In fact, most of them didn't find out about it until long after the facility had been shut down. But again, just like the article on the downwinders, this had a profound impact on the area around it. Just like those nuclear weapons tests, this enrichment facility caused a rise in cancers and other related diseases in the area, but it also left a hum of radiation in the region. One of the related facilities, a little ways outside of town, it's now been turned into a wildlife preserve, which almost puts me in mind of Chernobyl in a way, in the sense that like how wildlife has retaken that area, but don't worry about that. And you don't see a lot of wildlife preserves in Ohio, but there's that one at least. And my article includes photos taken from that preserve, and it seems very peaceful and really picturesque, until you start to notice some of the signs that are posted around that warn visitors not to stray from the paths, not to touch anything, especially anything metal, because there are still concerns about potential health risks related to the radiation from those facilities. And again, the point of this isn't really to point out any laxity or recklessness on the part of those who operate the facility. That's not really the point. The point is to show the students that different from the downwinders situation, this isn't something that only happened far out in the desert away from everyone else. It was happening right in people's backyards. The Cold War impacted people right in the middle of town, sometimes without them even knowing about it. Now, not all of the articles that I worked on were so solemn and somber as that. I also had the opportunity to work on another article that Dr. Scott mentioned, which is about the way the press newspapers covered Nikita Khrushchev's visit to Iowa. And that was absolutely fascinating. I think you'll really enjoy that one. This is arguably one of the most tense eras of the Cold War. It's about the same time as the Cuban Missile Crisis, but people were largely very welcoming and really interested in Khrushchev, with a few exceptions that I think you might expect. They tried to show off for him, trying to show him how great the whole country was, and particularly here in Iowa, trying to show him how great the farming community was. They took him everywhere from fancy dinners and clubs to rural homes and corn farms. And that was the part that really got him. Khrushchev really seemed to enjoy himself at the farms, joking along with the farmers as he learned about their crops and livestock and equipment. There are photographs of him joking around with these farmers in the article, and I really recommend you take a look at them. They're a lot of fun. He was even so excited about it that he took corn back to the Soviet Union and tried to get it established as a crop over there. And that ended up being kind of a disaster, but you'd have to ask a horticulturalist about that. I don't really know how any of that works. But one of the points of this article is to show the students, and really all of us, yet another way that people from the Midwest were directly affected by the Cold War. Khrushchev came to visit and talk to them, not just to talk to New York and LA and Washington, DC, but he came to Iowa as well. And both he and they were fascinated by each other. It was really kind of a, we're not so different, you and I sort of moment. And I think that's very important for people who are learning about the Cold War to understand and get a feeling of. And lastly, the last article that I worked on was about Soviet baby boomers, which was actually kind of surprising to me right off the bat, because for some reason it had never occurred to me to think about Soviet baby boomers. But of course, there must have been a baby boom in the Soviet Union, just as there was over here. And it turns out that they had a really similar experience of the Cold War to a lot of their American counterparts. Just like American baby boomers who were enraptured by the space race, Soviet baby boomers felt the same fascination. Just like American baby boomers had powerful and impassioned opinions about the Vietnam War, Soviet baby boomers had similarly powerful opinions about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1970s. They had very similar feelings about their experiences of the Cold War. And again, this is something that I think we want students to come away from this with an understanding of, that the Cold War involved a deep ideological divide in the world, and that division was real and it should be taken seriously, but it's still true that people are more or less the same around the world in a lot of ways, and we should try to see other people just as complexly as we see ourselves, even across a divide like this. And I think that these are some of the real draws and the real strengths of this project, showing young students who have very little context for what the Cold War was and what it was like to live in it, showing them that it's not only something that real people lived through, although that's very important, but it's also something that we can still learn from and that we're still experiencing the effects of today. And that's what I think I'm the most excited about for people to start using this project.
All right. Well, like my other fellow graduate students, I would like to thank Dr. Scott for inviting me to participate to this project, and the museum for having us tonight. It was a lot of fun to work on this project, so I'm glad that we get the chance to share it with people beyond just having the website being there, but we get to talk about it. So first of all, one of the reasons why it was so much fun to work on it is because you will remember that around that time last year, when we were working on the project, it was the very beginning of the pandemic. We were all like in our homes, kind of wondering what was happening with the world and wary of going outside, trying to figure things out. And that's when Dr. Scott was like, hey, do you guys want to work on a cool project about the Cold War? And I was like, yes, please give me kind of like an out from what's happening right now. So it was also really interesting because, as you might remember, Dr. Scott mentioned it earlier, I was working on the landscape case study section of the website, as well as the teaching portion of it, trying to put myself in the minds of teachers who would be trying to entice their own middle school or high school students to do the kind of work that historians do. So this was really my mindset that I had going into the project for the case study, because I was also trying to put together instructions for future students to kind of replicate my process. So I had to be really mindful of what people could do themselves and giving them like a step-by-step guide of how to do that. And also it was a really cool project for me because it was completely different from what historians are used to doing, which is going to the archives on your own. I mean, talking to the archivist a little bit, and then just like spending the day taking pictures of documents after documents after documents, breathing in the dust and all of that, which, don't get me wrong, is fun for a little bit. But doing a landscape case study is completely different and was a lot of fun in a lot of ways. So basically, as I was trying to figure out a process that could be replicated, I started where these days everyone starts, which is Google. That's where I learned that, I mean, I already knew, generally speaking, that there were a lot of missile silos in the Midwest, but more specifically, because of COVID travel restrictions and everything, I figured that it would be easiest for me to focus on our own backyard here in Lawrence. And I learned that there were Atlas missiles in the area. Specifically, they were part of the Atlas E category, and they were under control of the 548th Strategic Missile Squadron. They operated 9 missile sites in the area, and they were eventually decommissioned in 1965. So I was trying to find those sites around Lawrence because I found a website that told me that there were some in the area, and then I spent lots and lots of time just basically surveying Google Maps and zooming in and zooming out when I realized that, no, it's another farm. Okay, never mind, that's a farm too. Okay, what is that? I have no idea. I don't think it's a silo. I had this like map on the side of my screen with what a missile silo at the time sort of looked like, the standard template, you know, and I was really trying to identify the same kind of forms on the ground, because obviously the buildings are not there anymore, but the concrete slab would still be in the same shape. So I was just zooming in, zooming out in the general vicinity where the silos are supposed to be at, because I'd found that there was one north of Lawrence, about 30 minutes north of Lawrence, and one about 30 minutes south in the town of Warden, and that's the one I was trying to find. And so after a lot of time zooming in, zooming out, I find this patch of woods that looks kind of weird. So I was like, maybe I should look into that, because it's not a field. And in Kansas, when it's not a field, it kind of stands out, right? And so I zoom in and realize that, oh, it really does look a lot like this map I have on the side of what Atlas missile sites were supposed to look like at the time. So I look at the weather forecast, figured that the next day is supposed to be hot and sunny, like typical Kansas in the summer. And I figure might as well go check it out. And so you might have noticed from the accent, but I'm not from here. I'm from France. And so I was kind of expecting the same thing. In France, we have a lot of decommissioned military bases or areas or training, and like these kinds of things are always behind barbed wire with big signs that say, even 50 years later, do not trespass. It's still property of the French government, and the military will come after you if you do anything to that place. It's like those very, very scary signs that you really don't want to mess with. And so in my mind, when I was trying to go investigate this missile site here in Kansas, I figured, you know what, I'm going to drive out there, find the place. Hopefully it is what it is supposed to be. And there's going to be this like super huge sign in front of it, and I'm going to take a nice picture of it, and that's going to make for a great illustration for the website. And so I'm just driving out there, find the place, or at least I think I did, because all there was a road, dirt road at that point, with just a little flimsy piece of rope across it. And I was like, I mean, that doesn't really look scary. That doesn't look like a no trespassing sign. Obviously, it says do not drive your car in here. But I was like, maybe on foot, should probably go check it out until I find the big sign that tells me not to go in, right? So I start walking with my phone, like ensuring that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. So on the GPS, I see that this is where I was thinking the site was. Start walking and walking and walking. There's more and more grass as you walk towards the site. And then there's this place where apparently back in the day, there must have been like a huge gate, but there's no gate anymore. So I figured, well, since there is no big ass sign telling me not to enter, might as well go check it out a little bit further. And that's how I end up in front of the old Missile Bay doors. And now there's basically like a huge pond in front of it because of how the precipitation is just like accumulated in the little like area in front of the gate. And so basically I was just there with a bunch of frogs and kind of like looking around what was happening, you know. And so I took a couple pictures, but you can't really see much from in front of the gates because the whole complex is behind that. That would be like where the missile used to enter and exit from, and then like go up through the roof. And I was like, wouldn't it be cool if I could go like and check out the other side of it? So I start surveying my GPS on my phone. And it seems like back in the day, there must have been a road going around. So I kind of tried to find it. And that's also when I realized that as a historian, I was not prepared because I obviously knew I was not going to the archives, but it didn't really register in my mind that I was going to go exploring an abandoned ruin. And so I did not dress accordingly. I was wearing flip-flops and shorts, you know, summertime. And I was expecting to just stop at the gate and take a picture of this huge sign that was nowhere to be found. So that's how I decided that, well, let's do it for science. You know, I'm just going to plow through those pretty like tall grass patches and get some pictures for the website because I was adamant that it would be really great to compare the pictures of the website to the map from back in the day. So I was like, we're doing this. And I did. So you'll see on the website, if you go check it out, that I was able to take pictures from the whole complex from different perspectives, trying to really see what it must have been like at the time with the little like gates and the obviously I could not enter the complex, nor did I want to, but it was really, really interesting. So basically all that story to tell you that I found a way to investigate something that was right in our backyard, but that was still really hard to find, and that I think most people have no idea that it is there, which was really cool because again, in Europe, history is very much for everyone, there for everyone to see. You don't really have to go look for it. But here in the US, you have to dig a little bit deeper. And I thought that was a really cool challenge. And also I was able to really follow a process that anyone who's interested in doing something similar can just go and do. You don't have to have any special qualification, just be willing to spend a lot of time zooming in and zooming out on Google. So yeah, pretty much, I wish I had some sort of deep, meaningful conclusion like Adam and Michael, but it just turns out that my conclusion is y'all can do this as well, but be smarter than I was and dress accordingly, because by the time I got to my car, I had to remove over a dozen ticks from my legs. So yeah, that would be like my conclusion for you guys.
Well, thank you so much, all of you. Dr. Scott, did you have any closing words for this portion of the program before we jump into Q&A?
Right. I just wanted to mention, since all the graduate students were too modest to say so themselves, I mean, it's a really interesting group of graduate students because they're coming at this from different perspectives. Marjorie is a military historian, so this project really lined up well with her interests. Mike Hill works on the history of Alaska between sort of U.S. and Russian Empire, and also the history of the American West and environmental history. Adam Rogers working on the history of Soviet involvement in the Spanish Civil War, and so he works on international, global, and Russian history. So it was really a nice group of people, and I think too, you know, on the website we really tried to not have, you know, one voice, but really have all kinds of people's perspectives. So if you look at the oral histories, we have, you know, the accounts of cattle farmers who grew up next to nuclear test sites. You know, Adam talked about that. There's a Cherokee Nation member who was involved with trade agreements between local industries and communist nations. there's also a person from Soviet Moscow who's settled in the Midwest, and that's another way that this region continues to be international, is the migration from places that were involved in the Cold War, even some places that were opposed to the U.S. during the Cold War. People from those countries are living here with us and are part of our communities in the Heartland, and so I think that was really important to profile. And that being said, and I encourage you to check out the website yourselves. I put the link in the chat. Go through, check out the pictures that Marjorie took are really great, because you can see what this looks like now juxtaposed with what it used to look like. There's some great materials on the research laboratory that Adam mentioned, the exchanges that Mike mentioned. I encourage you to really check it out yourselves and play around with it. But sort of speaking of the diversity of views, I do want to hear any questions that people might have, or even stories of the Cold War that you want to share with the group.
Yeah, feel free, everyone, to throw your questions either into the Q&A or the chat. It looks like the chat is working for everybody, so that's great. I thought that was disabled. I have to say, I especially was interested in the idea of Soviet baby boomers. One of those historical things that was there, but you've never thought about before. So I really appreciated that. I'll get us started with a question. I wondered if each of you or anyone who wanted to might share a little bit about what you learned about this area of the country, specifically northeastern Kansas, by doing this project that you didn't know before. And maybe it's just in general something you found fascinating, or something in contrast to Russia, Soviet Union at the time for this area, or maybe something in common with it. I don't know if you're prepared to talk details in that way, but I just thought that might be an interesting exploration of some of the things you found out.
Well, I know I can say in meeting with Robert Swan, he kind of walked me through a decades-long career that's still ongoing, really, to tell you the truth, of kind of citizen diplomacy, and how so much of it was actually based here in Lawrence. I was really stunned how involved he and others in this part of Kansas were in trying to create places and moments of discussion between people I've read about in books and I've maybe read letters from and whatnot, and yet here was an individual who showing me pictures with these people in Kansas or traveling to Moscow or what have you. So I was really, it surprised me that, I don't know, like in Kansas, you don't read about Kansas in the middle of studies of U.S. foreign relations with the Soviet Union. So that was quite interesting for me.
Yeah, that also struck me too, is just these connections, these personal connections, and actually how much they've continued even decades after, we're almost 4 decades after the filming of the Day After, and some of these citizens exchanges. And obviously U.S.-Russian relations right now are very, very strained and difficult, but these connections were I think formed sincerely, and some cases have really endured. And it's striking how many of them there are in the Midwest. I spoke to Kay McIntyre for KPR Presents in a feature that will be running on the website in the next coming few weeks, and she spoke about her sister and her sister's exchanges with the Soviet Union and then Russia. And so the depth of citizen involvement, of citizen diplomacy, is really striking for a place that is landlocked and very far away from the Soviet Union.
Appreciate that very much. We did have a quick question to answer. What dates do you all consider bookend the Cold War?
I mean, I could start with that, but I don't want to. Maybe this is a great question, because it's really then we have to sort of define what we mean by the Cold War, and we get into all kinds of debates about when it started, how it started, who's to blame, and these debates go on and on. But I think generally speaking, I mean the beginning people generally date it 46, 47. So I mean, you could say that, with when the U.S. dropped atomic bomb on Japan, that was sort of the beginning of the atomic age, the atomic Cold War. But it's really with the worsening of relations in post-war Europe that you see it the most, and sort of debates about the division of Europe and about the Marshall Plan really sort of seals the deal. The ending is also really disputed, and I think that's a little bit more interesting because there's a narrative right now in the U.S. that the U.S. won the Cold War, and it won it with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But actually, if you go back to 1990, so when the Soviet Union was still around, but the Berlin Wall had fallen, and even before the Berlin Wall had fallen, Gorbachev and Reagan and Gorbachev and the first President Bush had basically declared the Cold War was over, and both sides were trying to eliminate or at least significantly reduce nuclear weapons. And so there is this period in which you think things might have gone differently, that the Soviet Union could have remained and the Cold War was already declared over. And so I don't actually see it ending with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I see it, really in 89 or 90. So I'd say like 47 to 1990 if you want a quick answer. But all those dates, are things that historians debate because they have a lot of meaning to them.
I would add real quick that, like Dr. Scott mentioned earlier, we do have a timeline on the website. So if you're interested in dates and framing things like that, that's a resource that you can use.
That's a great point. And for anybody who didn't catch that earlier, Dr. Scott shared that in the questions. It's coldwarheartland.ku.edu. So another question that came through was, after all the work you've done on this, what's still missing from the project? What else would you like to add, or is the project pretty well complete for you?
I mean, there's nothing's ever complete, right? I mean, I think for me at least, and I'd like the others maybe just to say a few words about maybe, in your research, what you wanted to find or what you would do if this project were to continue. But I mean, for me, I think it was, the oral histories were really intriguing. Some people, and this would take a lot of time to go out and gather these oral histories because they do take time to do. And it takes time to build rapport with people to get them to tell their stories. And like I said, this was done during the pandemic, so that we did telephone interviews and a few in-person sort of distance interviews. But I would love to get more perspectives, because one thing that really comes through is how heterogeneous, how sort of non-homogeneous and how diverse these perspectives are. People who grew up and lived in the same area. Even some people saying that they'll tell you, well, the Cold War didn't really affect me, and it was far away. And then they'll go through, the tour of duty they did in Vietnam, and the experience of duck and cover drills, and the experience of the grain embargo and the farm crisis that followed. And so all these things are really, bound up in global stories. And so I found that connection between the global and the local to be really, really interesting.
For me, since I worked on the section that was dedicated to teaching and providing resources for students to be able to do their own investigations, their own landscape case studies, their own oral histories, if I were to picture this project going even farther, it would be collecting the works of these students and incorporating them to the website and trying to see like all the cool things that they've been able to do with our like initial nudge, trying to then have more oral histories, like Dr. Scott just said, like, because those students would be conducting them with members of their families and all these kinds of things. So if there were something missing for me, it would be that part, the reaction from the students who this website is meant for.
Yeah, I think that's really good, Marjorie. And I think there's citizen diplomacy, which we've chronicled. You can talk about citizen science, where people go out and will help people who study migration of birds, help count birds. I think there's also a real role for citizen history, and teachers can really use these materials, and students, even middle school students can go out and do great oral history project, can do great case studies. Will probably be happy to roam around and abandoned missile sites and explore things. So I think there's a lot of great things people can do.
Another good one here. Do you see MidWestern Routes influencing the Cold War era presidents from the Heartland on their approach to the Soviets and the Cold War? It's a deep one.
I'm going to defer to my colleagues in U.S. history.
That's I mean, that's a really, really good question. In my approach, and Marjorie can jump in at any moment here as well. The first, and he's not actually the first, but Eisenhower comes to my mind immediately when I think of a Cold War president with MidWestern roots. And I would believe that probably, but I would also say as a non-Midwesterner myself, I don't know if I can necessarily accurately define what those kind of Midwestern roots would look like in his particular case. I've always thought with Eisenhower, for instance, about obviously his experiences during World War II as the Supreme Allied Commander. That's something that's always come to my mind. It's a really good question.
I second that. It's a really good question, and I don't have a good answer for it because I don't know enough about the president's roots and how they might have seen them as affecting their views of the world. But it definitely would be something to look into.
I mean, one thing. Go ahead, Adam.
Okay, I was just going to make the small point that I think a similar thing that I think we can see is that a lot of the presidents and other like people in government since then who were raised during the Cold War and grew up during the Cold War, I think that clearly has had a profound impact. And many of them obviously are from the Midwest because that's a big part of the country. And I think that has had a profound impact on the way they see diplomacy with the entire rest of the world, and especially Russia. I'm not an Americanist, so I don't know a ton about that, but I do think that's something we can clearly see has had a significant impact on the way that our political leaders see the entire rest of the world, and particularly the Russian Federation today.
Yeah, I'll just say I think two things really come to mind. I mean, obviously, there's a sort of folksiness that politicians will play up, to sort of play up their roots. And this is something that that Truman did, that Eisenhower did, and the Eisenhower Museum in Abilene, which is fabulous, as is the Truman Museum in Independence. These are great resources for us, but they're also there's a mythology around that these presidents helped construct. I'm not saying it was all made up, but they helped construct about their roots. But I think two things are important. One is that the fact that they were from the Midwest probably had some impact on the Midwest itself. So, the fact that the Iron Curtain speech was given in Fulton, Missouri, I mean, it's probably might not have been there had it not been for Truman being from Missouri. The amount of investment in sort of infrastructure, both things like military, industrial infrastructure, but also transportation infrastructure in the Midwest, may have been connected to their being from the region. The other thing I want to mention in terms of this mythology of sort of someone both being an international actor like the U.S. was, but also being being led by politicians with rural connections. This was something that you really saw on the Soviet side too. So Khrushchev, much like many American political figures, really played up his folksy country roots and his down to the earth, salt of the earth kind of demeanor. And in much of the same way, it was true. I mean, he came from a very humble background, but it was also a bit of an act, and he could be very cunning with how he used it too. So that's, I think, maybe a convergence point in kind of political culture that you might not expect between Soviet Union and the U.S. in the mid-century.
Mary, did you want to add anything? You had your hand raised. Nope, doesn't look like. Okay. I see a memory from Linda, one of our regular attendees. Nice to see you or hear from you, Linda. As kids, we remember covering our heads and hiding under our school desks. And as you go through the museum, we have a TV that plays ads and different things from different eras. And one of those is Bert the Turtle song, Duck and Cover, very catchy little jingle. The other thing I'd mention from the Johnson County Museum that we see on display are the civil defense books, specifically put out from the county government here in Olathe. And then, of course, thinking about connections to Johnson County, the Sunflower Army ammunition plant was in production, I believe, through the entirety of the Cold War, or at least through the end of the Vietnam War. What other things would a regular person in Lawrence or Olathe or Overland Park be experiencing during the Cold War that we might not be thinking about? Those sort of three major things, but what else might be happening? And a very general question, I know, but.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think, what Linda's memory of doing the duck and cover drills, that's a really common one. And that's obviously, etched in, the brains of anyone who was a child during the Cold War growing up in this period. That's a really big one. Here in Lawrence, I mean, there's some interesting things that I think about every day. And one is that the university itself transformed dramatically during the Cold War. So there was a huge shift with the launch of Sputnik, the first satellite, human-made satellite in space, and then the Soviet space program. There's a huge shift in the way that universities operated, and a big infusion of federal funding. I mean, not just for universities, but for the entire education system, to catch up with the Soviet Union, to train scientists, to train specialists, to establish the center that I now direct at KU, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. So to gain expertise on the enemy, right? And so it really changed the university. It changed the way the university operates, the way it relates to the federal government, the way it relates to the globe in general. You can also see it in the architecture. There's a lot of great mid-century architecture throughout the Midwest. This was something that struck me when I moved here. I'm originally from the Boston area, and so I'm not a native Midwesterner. My wife is, but when I came here, I was struck by how much mid-century architecture there was, and that's there are historians who sort of work on that. How that architecture was influenced by ideas of the period. I mean, certainly bomb shelters are often part of the design, but there's also a broader mid-century architecture that you can actually see cross Cold War borders across the Iron Curtain.
It's really interesting. Thank you. Anybody else want to answer that question? Feel free, attendees, to put other memories or questions in the chat. I have one more question that I'd written down, and maybe it's too narrow, but I'm curious if when you or others talked to some of the old timers in the area, if they identify or conceptualize the Cold War as more of a struggle of democracy against something or of capitalism against something else, or maybe both of those things, but I'm just curious. And maybe that's not an educated question either.
No, it's an educated question. I think it's really hard to generalize because people really have different views. Some people we talk to with the oral histories, emphasize ideology, capitalism versus communism. Some, sort of spoke about Russia and the Soviet Union interchangeably, even though Russia is no longer communist. So I think you can really find a diversity of views. But I think it is striking how, for me as a Russian historian, I may be biased, but how central Russia remains for Americans and their thinking about the world, and actually how central even the Russian president Vladimir Putin, is probably. I talk to people, I would bet more Americans know who the leader of Russia is than know who the leader of say Canada or Mexico is, even though they're our neighbors. There's a real sort of important place for Russia, even if it's one that's sort of about it being the opposite or the enemy or the other, that really remains salient, and that's really because of the Cold War.
So the individual that I spent the most time speaking with, Robert Swan, for him the big issue was about nuclear weapon proliferation. And that was a big concern in his mind, and kind of served as the motivating factor behind all that he did in his efforts of citizen diplomacy.
Great. I think in the time that remains, I do want to take up Mary's question. You know, if the grad students be willing to sort of say in maybe a minute or less, I know we're running out of time, just very briefly what your dissertation's on. And I should mention that Mike Hill recently defended his PhD dissertation. So he is no longer a graduate student, but he does have a great dissertation to talk about. So maybe we'll start with Mike, then Adam, then Margie. If you could just very briefly sort of say in a brief form what you're working on.
Okay, so my dissertation began when I read an article published in 1867 in California, saying that the purchase of Alaska justified the United States taking any piece of land on any continent in any hemisphere anywhere in the world. And so that kind of really blew me away. So I explored Alaska as an example of US empire in an intermediary stage between continental empire of the 19th century and overseas empire of the 20th century. Leave it at
that. Yeah, I am working on a dissertation on Russian involvement in and perception of the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, essentially taking perspectives from people in the Soviet Union, as well as people that had fled Russia after the revolution, or people who, Trotsky and his followers, and anarchists, and people, all sorts of different Russian experiences, and looking at the ways that they perceived and participated in the Spanish Civil War, and actually arguing that in a lot of ways they saw the Spanish Civil War as the continuation of the Russian Civil War, and trying to build a continuity between those two.
My dissertation is focusing on very recent history. I'm studying the most recent war in Iraq that lasted from 2003 to 2011. And specifically, I'm studying the ways that the US Army and Marine Corps addressed the rise of the insurgency in Iraq. And the story that I'm telling is actually kind of counterintuitive for most people, because when you think of the military as an institution, you're really thinking usually as this hierarchy, implementing things from the top down, right? And so my dissertation, I've discovered that the creation of counterinsurgency tactics and the implementation of counterinsurgency during the war in Iraq actually had the opposite direction. It really started with grassroots efforts in Iraq with soldiers from at the lowest ranks, right? So like lieutenants, captains, and their units really trying to find a way to address the situation to which they were confronted. And then it really percolated up the hierarchy to the operational level, and finally was integrated into the military institution stateside. So kind of this is the arc of the story I'm telling. And then it was brought back to Iraq during the surge, and I'm trying to analyze whether this effort was successful or not, which is sort of difficult because I thought that when I started working on the 21st century, I figured there would be like so much material for me to access, and I would be able to talk to people. Not only are the materials classified, but also the pandemic hits, I couldn't talk to people. So hopefully this next year is really going to allow me to figure things out and plug some holes.
Thank you each very much. It's fascinating the spread over time and space and topics that you all have, and yet you all got to come together on this really interesting digital history project with Dr. Scott. I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I'm going to give a couple of quick announcements and then we will wrap it up. At the Johnson County Museum, our next temporary exhibition called Paul McCobb, America's Designer, opens on Saturday, May 22nd. It is a look at a mid-century modern furniture and furnishing designer who created both affordable and available through department stores furniture and furnishings for a new America, and was available in stores across the United States, especially here in Johnson County as the suburbs were growing. Our next program is June 10th. It's one of our Retro Housewife Guide 2 programs. This one is about mid-century modern furniture and decorating in our all-electric house, a full-scale actual house, ranch-style house in the Johnson County Museum. And also on June 17th, we will have Kansas City Area Refugees, a program with Dr. Sophia Khan, the director of KC for Refugees organization, because World Refugee Day is June 20th. So check us back out again for those programs. Come and see our exhibit when it opens on the 22nd. I'll be following back up with surveys after this. I want to say big congratulations to you all for your work on this project, especially during a pandemic. While continuing your studies. That's amazing. I'm excited to go check out more about this project. Again, that is coldwarheartland.ku.edu. I wish you all the best. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Take care, and I'm going to stop that recording.